A pickup truck pulled up outside, and 2 ranchers got out. "Thanks, Keith. You may have just given me a motive." The bells on the door jingled as the 2 men walked in.
"Hey, fellas," Randall greeted. "You betcha, Charlie girl," he said to me. "Ain't no problem."
I walked out to the car, carrying my small napkin-wrapped gift for Rusty. He gobbled the bread crusts as if they were the last ones in the world. As I pulled out of the dirt parking area, I could see Keith inside, fingers snagged into the edges of his red suspenders, joking with his 2 new customers. Interesting man. I hadn't planned on spending this much time being sidetracked on my way to Phoenix, but as long as I was, I decided to stop in at Sheriff Buckman's office to learn more about Sophie's death. His car was parked out front when I arrived. "You didn't tell me the woman killed in the mine was Sophie," I accused, once I was standing across from his desk.
"Yeah, I did," he answered, not looking up from the folder he was writing in. "Left a message on your machine this morning."
He looked up at me.
"What? You didn't get it? I thought that's why you were here."
I didn't go into details about my planned trip to Phoenix. "No, I was just having lunch at Keith's place, and he told me."
"Bet he also told you that the rumors all over town that she and Rory Daniels were having a fling."
"Well, yes, he did."
"Damn it! It's so frustrating the way these things get going. Worse than a damn wildfire."
"So they weren't?" I knew my instincts weren't totally off.
"Look," he said, coming around the desk and closing the door to his private office. "Only a couple people in this office even know this. No, Sophie and Rory weren't involved. Not in that way. Trust me on that." He rubbed his temples gingerly. "We're close to having some answers, and I just hope that's the end of it." He lifted his head. "I can't tell you anything more now, but I don't want you saying nothing around town." I still wasn't satisfied, but I assured him I wouldn't. I walked out to my car feeling down. Poor Sophie. Despite the fact that for one brief period I'd considered her a suspect in her father's death, I'd liked her. She'd still had that independent cowgirl spirit that's been completely bred out of city kids, bred out of a lot of country kids today, too, unfortunately. I started the Jeep and hit the road. 3 people dead in White Oaks, and I still didn't have Willie McBride. When I came to a stop at the 4-way intersection in Carrizozo, I glanced in my rearview mirror. A midnight blue sedan had stopped behind me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something was off. The pair in the front seat certainly weren't from around here. Even at a glance, her heavy makeup and his shoulder-length wavy hair told me they didn't fit with the cowboy set I'd become acquainted with here in southern New Mexico. And the car was shiny clean. One short drive down any of our dirt roads would have fixed that. Tourists, probably. I pulled through the intersection, and when they didn't turn off, I reduced my speed so they could pass me before the road narrowed to 2 lanes again. They didn't, and I eventually sped up to my own comfortable pace. It was mid-afternoon by the time I reached Las Cruces, and I realized I had hours to go yet before I'd reach Phoenix. I stopped to grab a quick burger and place a call to the motel where we'd stayed before, guaranteeing a room for late arrival. "Ready?" I said to Rusty, tugging at his leash. I'd walked him to a dirt lot beside the hamburger place, and he was completely entranced with all the new smells he discovered there. I was already way past my bedtime when I reached the outskirts of Apache Junction. I spotted the exit to my hiking trail and whizzed on past it. A decent night's rest was in order before I started anything strenuous. In Mesa, I exited at Power Road and pulled into the same parking spot I'd used the last time I was here. Rusty waited in the car while I checked in and followed me excitedly as I carried our things into the room. "Yeah, it's fine for you to jump around with all that energy," I told him. "You slept on the back seat the whole way." I pulled out my notes with phone numbers of the places that might rent me a horse, but it was too late to call anyone tonight. I'd spent the past 6 hours thinking about my plans for finding Willie, so there wasn't much else to do now but brush my teeth and go to sleep. The sun shone as a brilliant outline against the blackout drapes when I opened my eyes. Rusty sat at my bedside, resting his large head on the sheets. "What?" I groaned. "Do I have to take you out before I'm even awake?" He danced toward the door, verifying that his urge to pee was more desperate than mine. Okay. I pulled on the clothes I'd taken off the night before and slid my feet into my walking shoes without benefit of socks.
Clipping the leash to his collar, I let him pull me down the hall to the outside entrance, and we dashed across the sidewalk and the chipped rock landscaping. Thank goodness he'd given me time to put on my shoes. The air was warm already, promising a hot day ahead. I glanced at my watch and saw that it was already after 8. I better get started. "Come on," I urged Rusty, tugging him away from a fascinating oleander bush. Back in the room, I dialed one of the stables Dick Chambers had recommended. Line busy. Dialed the second one, and a man with a rusted voice answered. I explained that I wanted to rent one of his horses to go up into the superstitions.
"Much riding experience?" he asked.
"Some, but not very recent." I didn't admit that I hadn't been on a horse since my high school days. I'd been a reasonably decent horsewoman then. Surely it would come back to me.
"Then I'll have to send a guide with you," he said.
Guide? I hadn't counted on having another person along.
"Can't have you getting thrown and my horse running loose out there in the rocks. She'd die of heat stroke for sure."
I planned on spending a night or 2 out, and I really don't want to spend them with a strange man. Do you have any women guides?
"Well, no. My cowboys are all real gentlemen, though."
I finally convinced him to let me go alone, provided I left him a credit card number and authorized him to charge it for the value of the horse if I didn't bring her back. I didn't mention that he'd also have my vehicle as hostage. Surely a nearly new Jeep was worth more than his precious horse. I got directions to his place and told him I'd be there within an hour. "Sheesh," I said to Rusty after I hung up the phone. I showered and redressed, putting on my hiking boots and smearing sunscreen on everything that was left exposed. I rechecked my equipment and fit everything except the sleeping bag inside the duffel. I hoped Mr. Cowboy's horse could handle a person plus a little bit of gear. I made sure my maps and GPS were near the top of the bag. Rusty trotted along beside me to the parking lot. I wrestled the duffel and sleeping bag while I used my key to open the back hatch of the Jeep. "Okay, hop in," I told the dog, opening his back door once I had the gear stowed. For some reason, I glanced across the parking lot as I was opening my own door. 1 row over and 4 or 5 cars down from mine sat a midnight blue sedan. The bright yellow and red New Mexico plate caught my eye. An electric shock of fear shot through me. The odds of a couple of tourists being at the same intersection at the same time in Carrizozo, then ending up at the same motel as mine in another state, in a metropolitan area of 3.5 million people, were staggering. Impossible, I'd say. I scanned the windows facing the parking lot. Sheer drapes covered them all, revealing nothing. My mind shot back over the trip. How many stops had I made along the way? How had they followed me without my seeing them, especially once I hit city traffic after dark? Paranoia crept in. A transmitter of some kind. They could have attached it when I stopped for food in Las Cruces, perhaps. I reached into my glove compartment for a tire gauge. Pretending to check tires, I ran my hand around the wheel well of each. Behind the right rear, I found it. A tiny black plastic thing with a strong magnet on the back. I pulled it loose and noticed that a small red light on it was winking with slow regularity, like an evil eye winking. Without thinking, I reached out and stuck it to the underside of the car next to mine, a white Cadillac. Deal with that, suckers. I got back into the Jeep and started it. I was backing out of my slot when I looked up and saw the man with the long wavy hair walking toward the blue car. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. Oh, cripes. Had he seen me move the transmitter? I thrust the Jeep in gear and raced out of the driveway without looking either way. In my rear view, I could see him running for his car. Rush hour traffic was well underway. I caught up with a pack of cars that were doing nearly 60 on the 45 limit boulevard. A couple of rash moves later, I was well within their midst. It isn't easy making unsafe lane changes, speeding, and keeping your eyes on the rearview mirror at the same time. I took a couple of unnecessary turns, winding my way through a small residential area, watching behind me all the time. After I was pretty sure I'd lost him, I consulted my map again and took a course that would lead me east, past Apache Junction. The stable consisted of a rustic wooden building and a couple of corrals containing a dozen or so horses that appeared content to chew on the wisps of hay sticking out of the wooden trough at one end of the pen. A shiny blue pickup truck with a white horse trailer hitched to it was parked at the right-hand edge of the dirt parking area.
"Hi, you must be Charlie,"
said the man who came out of the wooden building. He looked like his voice had sounded on the phone, kind of rusted out in places.
"I'm Bert."
"Okay if I leave my car here?" I asked. I backed into a spot where the vehicle would be shielded by the building from anyone driving down the road. I hoped my pursuers were good and lost by now, but that paranoid feeling had tracked me all the way from the motel. What if they'd been able to listen to my phone calls? They could know exactly where I was headed. Bert nodded assent, and we went inside and transacted a little paperwork.
"I'll let you take Molly. She's a nice gentle mare, but not so old that it'd take you forever to get there. And she's good around dogs. Smart to take a dog along."
"Thanks." I showed him on the map roughly where I was going, and told him I had a cell phone with me.
"That's fine, if you can get it to work," he said. "Half the time them things don't do so good in the mountains. Might have to find yourself a high spot. Now, this is where you say you started before," he said, indicating the trailhead I'd shown him on the topo map. "Okay, here's where you are now. You want to take the trail from our place right to here."
He drew a thick line on my map with a pencil.
"That's going to tie you in with the one you were on."
I studied the map for a minute. Today's route was longer than the original one, but not by much, and it tied me to the main trail before the point where I'd need to be watching for Willie's markers. We went out to the Jeep where I retrieved my duffel and sleeping bag, while Bert singled out Molly, a trim palomino, from the crowd of horses and led her out of the corral. She nudged at me with her velvety nose, and I stroked her forehead.
"Don't look like she'll have no trouble making friends," Bert said. "She's a good 'un."
I reached into the duffel and pulled out an apple I'd snagged from the motel's free continental breakfast and cut a chunk of it off with my pocket knife. Molly took it gently with her teeth and crunched at it. Just to keep peace, I cut a smaller chunk and gave it to Rusty. Each of them got one more piece before the apple was gone. Wiping the juice off my hands and knife onto my jeans, I stashed the knife and pulled out the GPS. The horse turned her head to look at it, hoping for more treats, and I showed her it wasn't edible.
"What you got there?"
Bert asked. I showed him how I programmed in our current location. "Now I can find my way back here from anywhere."
"Well, I'll be danged. Heard of them things, but never seen one before."
He helped me strap my pack behind the saddle, and he seemed a bit more at ease with our deal when I swung my leg over Molly's back. "I'm hoping to be back by tomorrow evening," I told him, "but I may decide to stay out an extra day or so. I've got food for 4 days."
"Okay," he said,
turning to go back inside. "Bert," he turned around. "Listen, some guy and this lady with way too much makeup were hassling me at my motel this morning. I don't think they could have followed me here, but if anybody comes around asking where I've gone, don't let them know you've seen me, okay?"
"Sure thing,"
he replied easily. "Long as he's got that credit card, he probably doesn't care what I do," I said to the horse and dog after Bert had disappeared. I was right about my writing abilities coming back quickly. It felt a little awkward for the first few minutes, but Molly was compliant and easygoing. From the stables we headed down a short dip through an old wash. The trail was clear as it came up the other side, and within 30 minutes or so we'd connected to the main Forest Service trail. Overhead, a thin layer of clouds filtered the sun's hot rays, cooling the temperature just a little. Willie's markers were easier to spot this time, since I knew what I was looking for, and by noon we'd reached the point where I decided to turn around the last time. "Let's stop for some lunch." I needed to get down and stretch my legs as much as I needed food. My hip joints creaked as I swung down off the horse. "Oh yeah, I'm going to be feeling this tomorrow," I said to Rusty as I looped Molly's reins around a branch in the shade of a tree with widespread lacy leaves. I pulled a little can of stew and one of my water bottles from my provisions, along with Willie's map. "Okay, our next marker is a rock cairn about 50 yards down the next gully." I looked at the dog. "Do they say people who talk to animals are crazy? What do you think?" He looked back at me like this was the most normal thing in the world. That was good enough for me. I peeled back the pull tab on my stew and ate it cold with the spoon on the pocket knife. I was feeling decidedly like a real outdoors person now. Tonight I'd have a hot dinner, I decided. One of those MREs, maybe. They even came with little desserts. Using a tiny bit of my precious water, I rinsed my spoon and dried it on the leg of my jeans. Boy, would they be right before this trip was over. The empty can and lid went into a plastic bag I'd brought along for the purpose, believing that hikers should always pack all trash out with them. I stuffed everything back into the duffel on Molly's back and did a couple of leg stretches before climbing back on. "Westward ho!" I yelled to Rusty, pointing down the trail. Being alone in the desert with two animals for company was helping me drop all my inhibitions, obviously. The terrain was becoming rockier now, and I had to watch carefully for the very faint path. Rusty loped ahead, nose to the ground occasionally. He seemed to have a pretty good idea of where to go, and I wondered if he might be catching a scent, animal or human. If it was human, I hoped it was Willie McBride. We came upon the wash indicated on Willie's map sooner than I expected. The rocky ground dropped away 30 or 40 feet below us. I pulled the map out to verify. Sure enough, there was Weaver's Needle on our left. According to the topo map, this gully would lead us into a sort of canyon with pretty steep sides. Looking to my right, that appeared to be true. A mountain covered with boulders rose sharply to the east of us. "Okay," I said. "Let's see how we're going to get down there." Rusty trotted back and forth, sniffing the ground. I turned Molly to my left, toward ground that seemed a little less steep. The dog found a place where a winding route appeared, a narrow opening of sand between the rocks. I guided Molly toward it. She hesitated at first, but Rusty, seeing that this is what I wanted to do, led the way. He bounded downward with no reservations. The horse picked her way delicately through the openings, following him. I simply hung on and tried not to throw her off balance. At the bottom was a smooth highway of sand, easy to follow. Molly wanted a little more freedom now, and I let her trot happily for a short while. Then I saw a hoof print in the sand. Chapter 19. "Whoa there, girl," I said, pulling her up. I stared hard at the sandy surface. There, clearly, where the wind had been unable to blow them away, were two sets of prints. One was either a small horse or, more likely, a donkey, and the other was human. I slipped down from my saddle to look closer. The human tracks looked like Western boots, smooth bottoms, deeper heel. Now, I'd like to be able to say that I could tell it was a male, slender, and probably in his 80s, but I couldn't. I stared at the prints a long time. I traced the outline of one boot print with my finger. Then I looked up at the canyon sides that rose on either side of me. The only sound was the rhythmic chirping of cicadas and the occasional screech of a bird. Even the wind was silent down here. I stood up slowly and looked around. "Come on," I whispered to my companions. I gathered Molly's reins in and led her behind me. Rusty stayed near my heel, obviously sensing something in my tone. I tiptoed for a while, then realized that was pretty silly. The tracks were clear and easy to follow, messed up only now and then as some small animal's prints brushed across the trail. I paused and pulled Willie's sketch from my back pocket with my left hand, keeping hold of Molly with the right. The trail on the map followed this canyon for perhaps a quarter of a mile. Then the directions became less precise. There was a large X ahead and to the left, but no indication of what kind of marker I should be looking for. I let out a breath of frustration. Willie, of course, knew what to look for. His map wasn't meant to allow anyone to walk right up to his mine and help themselves. I stuffed the map back into my pocket and continued to follow the tracks. At least 30 minutes had passed since we'd wound our way down into the gully. I consulted the map again and decided the perspective must be off. The tracks led deeper into the canyon, whose walls now rose steeply 100 or more feet above our heads. Now completely in shadow, the air became cooler here. Then abruptly, the tracks ended. I stopped short, surprised, looked again at the steep canyon walls. An eerie feeling crept across the back of my neck. I looked at Rusty. He'd wandered to the edge of the sandy gully and sniffed casually at a rock. Molly seemed at ease. I decided I was just giving myself the creeps, imagining things that weren't there. I scanned the edges of the wash for some sign of where the tracks might have gone. At first glance, I noticed only boulders, cactus, and weeds. Nothing different. Then I noticed it. On my left, about 20 yards ahead, a small wooden cross, the only man-made object I'd seen in hours. A cross. An X. I nudged Molly's side and started walking toward it. The piles of boulders continued upward, without a break that I could see. "Come here," I whispered to Rusty, waving him over. "Hold on to her." He took Molly's reins in his mouth and sat down on my command. The docile horse stood quietly. I crept slowly toward the edge of the sand, looking up at the small cross, which stood about 20 feet above me. Gently testing each rock, I stepped up a level, then another. When I reached the cross, I noticed that it had been there a long time. It was made of weathered wood, gray now, with deep crevices outlining the grain. Crusted dirt covered the west-facing surfaces, blown there by storm winds. I stood beside it and looked around. Below me, Rusty waited patiently, still holding the horse's reins. I turned slowly, and there at my feet was an opening. From the bottom of the gully it hadn't been apparent, but at this height I could tell that the cross actually stood on a little promontory that had formed when rushing water had hit some particularly large boulders and redirected itself downward at a different angle. The resulting formation was a bit of a mini canyon with an opening into the side of the large canyon. Protected from water and weather, it was probably also difficult to spot from the air. I turned in all directions. The narrow opening could easily be a mine, I thought. At the mouth, it was probably 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. I edged my way down to it, losing sight of my animals as I dropped below the wooden cross. I quickly discovered that I couldn't tell a thing by standing outside the hole, and decided I wasn't about to go in there without a light. As far as I knew, it could just as easily be a mountain lion's dwelling. I backed away, crawling back up toward the cross. Rusty had gotten to his feet, and Molly shifted with uncertainty.
"It's okay,"
I called out.
"I'm back."
My voice echoed off the multitude of rock surfaces. A slight breeze ruffled my hair, and I looked back up and down the sandy wash below me. I still hadn't answered my initial question. There were the tracks, 2 sets of them, including mine, leading right to the spot. Then they abruptly stopped. Where had they gone? And was it Willie McBride I'd been following? Rusty whined. "Okay, I'm coming," I assured him. I started down the rocky incline. About 5 feet from the cross, I spotted the answer. Brush marks. The person had used the classic old Indian trick of swiping out his tracks. Whether he'd used a tree branch or something else, I couldn't tell, but I could see the wide arc sweeping across the sandy stream bed. I'd missed them before because my angle wasn't quite right. It was probably only because of the sun's position right now that I could see them at all. I stayed in place and scanned ahead. The brush marks continued around the next curve in the wash. I scrambled down to the sand. "Come on," I whispered to Rusty, taking Molly's reins from him. I climbed into the saddle again, and we followed the brush marks. As we rounded the curve, my eyes searched for traces. It was like working a difficult jigsaw puzzle where just the faintest nuance of color is going to tell you which is the right piece. They were there, but hard to spot. I walked the horse slowly, following them for perhaps another quarter mile. The canyon was becoming increasingly narrow, only about 30 feet wide at this point. I felt Molly's nervousness as her head turned, eyeing the steep rocks beside us. I found myself doing the same. And there it was. Tucked into a hollow behind a huge boulder was a narrow path leading toward the top. A small clearing, no more than 20 or 30 feet in diameter, stood above us, about 20 feet above the sandy bottom. The path led to it, then continued to wind its way through the boulders to the top of the ridge. In the middle of the clearing were the remains of a tiny campfire. A slender stream of smoke rose from its center. I dismounted and handed off the reins to Rusty once more, signaling him to wait there. The path was narrow but well-worn, and not nearly as hard to follow as the one we'd taken through the desert. I walked up to the campfire and stooped over it, stretching my hand over the center. It had been hastily covered in dirt, but was still warm. I glanced around the area. The fragile desert grass had been trampled into the dusty earth. A couple of good-sized rocks with flat tops had been arranged as seats near the fire. At the far edge of the clearing, out of sight from below, stood an old-fashioned pup tent, the kind we rigged up as kids, where you basically have a blanket held up at either end by a couple of little poles. They always drooped in the center, and this one was no exception. Inside the tent, I could see a cardboard box with the top flaps folded closed. Beyond the tent, I realized that the little clearing extended beyond what I'd seen from below. A second clear area, this one smaller than the first, was ringed by boulders. The vegetation in this area was far greener, indicating that there must be a small spring among the boulders. Together, in an aerial view, the 2 spots would resemble a figure 8. Tethered to the ground in the second clearing was a small mule. It was nosing through the grass and didn't appear to notice me. I turned slowly, surveying the spot, but couldn't see any other sign of the inhabitant. Was this Willie McBride's camp? I called out his name. No response but the gradually increasing wind. Now what? Below me, Rusty and Molly waited patiently. I looked around the camp once more, but didn't see any sign of Willie. And what if it wasn't Willie's camp? What if I just tracked a stranger up here? The chill that tickled my bare arms wasn't entirely due to the thickening clouds. I was a trespasser here. I decided to turn around. I followed the little path back down to the sandy bottom. "What do you think, buddy?" I asked the dog. "Nobody's up there." I took Molly's reins and stroked the horse's neck. The wind was picking up. If I hoped to get back to civilization before nightfall, I needed to head back now. Right now. If I decided to camp out, I better be thinking about a spot soon. I couldn't turn back, I decided. I'd come too far to find Willie. If there was any chance this was his camp, I needed to find him. I looked back up at the tent in the clearing. Maybe if I just looked through that cardboard box, I might find something that would verify whether I was near McBride or whether I'd tracked a total stranger. Leaving the animals behind, I started up the path again. "Hold it right there, Missy." I stared up, right into the muzzle of a gun. Chapter 20. "Willie McBride?" I asked. "I heard you the first time, when you shouted it out for the whole world," he growled. He didn't look much like the photo Dorothy had given me, but he looked more like I'd pictured him. Faded Levi's, flannel shirt, beat-up straw cowboy hat with wisps of thin white hair showing below. His weathered face was screwed up into a frown, and he looked far more at home here in this setting than in the photo, wearing his one suit and tie. One gnarled hand held a Smith & Wesson .357, the other rested dramatically on his hip. "Who are you?" The hand holding the gun wavered, sending the barrel on a spasmodic course from my chest to my head and down to my abdomen. His finger was firmly on the trigger, I noticed. Behind me, Rusty growled, and McBride swung the gun toward him. "Rusty! No!" I ordered. "Back away!" The dog backed off 2 paces, but didn't sit down. McBride brought the gun back up at me. His hand still tremored like a shrub in an earthquake. Could you aim that thing somewhere else?" I asked. My voice didn't come out nearly as steady as I wanted it to. "Not till I know who you are," he said, steadying the gun with both hands and aiming it at my face. "What do you want with me?" I took a shaky breath. "My name's Charlie Parker. Your family hired me to find you. They've been worried." His eyes narrowed. "Which one? Who hired you?" I had a feeling the wrong answer here would turn me into vulture food. "Well, all of them," I hedged. "Melanie's real worried. And Bea. You know there was a big reunion at Dorothy's, and they all really wanted you there." "Dorothy, huh? She hire you?" "Well, like I said, they all want to know you're safe." I focused for a second on the gun barrel and swallowed. "Look, you're a grown man. I can't make you go back if you don't want to." "You can't." For the first time, the gun drifted away. "I'm not the law." I guess this wasn't the best time to mention that the law was looking for him, too. "Look, could we maybe sit down for a little bit?" "Better bring your horse on up here," he said. "Tether her over there, by a little bit." Molly looked relieved when I walked back down the incline to get her. I patted her neck and spoke gently to her as I led her up the narrow path and tied her reins around a boulder in the mule's clearing. Clouds covered the sky completely now, and the wind sent a distinct chill through the air. I pulled my jacket from the duffel. McBride had stuck the gun into the waistband of his Levi's and was stirring the campfire back to life. "Better plan on staying the night up here," he said. "Wouldn't be smart to head down that wash right now." He got a small flame going and added a few bits of sagebrush to it. "You got your own food?" he asked. "Yeah. I'd be happy to share, if you like MREs." I sat on one of the flat rocks, and he took the other. He made a sound that came out something like a snort, something like a laugh. The light was fading quickly now, and he suggested we cook our dinner while we had a little light to work by. I retrieved one of my packeted meals and a bottle of water,
Drake had showed me how these things worked once. Willie pulled the box from his tent and rummaged through it, coming up with a can of chili and a spoon. While he ratcheted the lid of the can with a tool on his pocket knife, I ripped the top off the plastic MRE bag and examined the contents. I had a main dish of macaroni and cheese, a vacuum-sealed bag claiming to contain a biscuit, a similar one with a brownie, we'd see about that, and a packet of plastic flatware. I poured water into the mac and cheese dinner packet and set it against the base of my rock. Within minutes, it began to boil. Willie had stripped the paper label from his can of chili and set the can into the coals. While dinner cooked, I pulled plastic bowls from my duffel and gave Rusty food and water. Although Molly seemed content sharing the desert grass and spring water with the mule, I opened the feed bag of oats Bert had sent along for her. "So, Dorothy couldn't stand me going off on my own," Willie said. We sat on our respective rocks, each eating our version of gourmet fare. "Had to send somebody to look for me." "I guess so," I said noncommittally. "Can't believe I ever claimed that woman as my daughter. Or the boy, either." He chewed on his chili slowly. "I guess every family's got someone they'd rather not claim." "Well, the other two's okay, I guess. Bea turned out fine, and she don't bother me much. Dorothy and Felix, though, they're a pair." He pulled a waxed paper tube of saltine crackers out and dipped one into the can, then stuffed the whole thing into his mouth. "Once she got that law degree, it was like all of a sudden she knew everything, and her old man knew nothing. I got so sick of hearing how I needed me a will. And I needed me a new will. Of course, she wasn't charging me no legal fees for it. I would have put my foot down about that. No, sir." "Why'd she say you needed a new one? Seems like one will would be good enough for anybody," I said. We were falling into a comfortable conversation, and I discovered that the MRE mac and cheese wasn't so bad. "You'd think." He scraped at the sides of the chili can. "But Felix, now he's the one been pestering me to death. Guess a person just shouldn't college-educate their kids. Their mother really pushed for it, though. Rest her soul." "What was Felix pestering about?" "My land. Place in Albuquerque, in the North Valley." I didn't want to sidetrack him again by admitting that I'd been there. "That boy wants me to deed the place over to him. He's got him a place in Socorro. Doesn't even want to live on my land." "So why does he want it?" "Mineral springs. There's 2 of them on the place. Strange, I always thought. None of the neighbors got springs on their places. These are just little ones, you know. One of them's got covered over by now. But that Felix, he thinks he'll get him running again. Build some fancy spa thing there. Get rich people from all over the place to come there and soak in the water." "Ain't that the funniest thing you ever heard?" He chuckled out loud, presumably at the thought of people paying money to come sit in water that had been seeping out of his land for ages. "Maybe there's more to it than that," I said, remembering Randall's suggestion that if the thermal resources were vast enough, it might be a place to build a power plant. Either plan probably explained Felix's proprietary air of the day I'd run into him at the spring. "Well, Felix sure has him some fancy ideas about it. It's that college education, you know." "So, do you think Dorothy's new version of the will has something in it about that?" I asked, opening my vacuum-packed brownie. "Wouldn't surprise me. I read the darn thing. Couldn't make sense of it a bit. The first will, the one she had me do up a long time ago, that wasn't so bad. I knew what it was saying. This thing, it's got all kinds of clauses. I think that's what they call them. Clauses that don't make no sense at all. I said, I ain't signing that thing till I know what it means. She said, Dad, you better do it now. You're not getting any younger. He mimicked Dorothy's nasal whine pretty well. He stood up and chucked the chili can out into the bushes. I forced myself not to say anything. I'd go out there later and pick up his trash and haul it back with my own. I crumpled my little bits of packaging materials, including the remains of the brownie. I'd always thought I never met a brownie I didn't like, but
I finally had.
She wanted me to sign that new will right there on the spot. Don't think she even showed it to the other kids. And she darn sure didn't want me to take it home with me. Hell, I might have taken it into my head to show it to another lawyer and get me a second opinion. I said that to her once, about getting a second opinion, and she just about hit the roof.
I didn't have any trouble picturing that. The wind had picked up even stronger now, and a few drops sprinkled out of the sky. Lightning flashed in the distance beyond Weaver's Needle. Willie wandered outside the circle of firelight, mentioning something about seeing about a tree. It reminded me that I hadn't answered nature's call myself since early afternoon. Using my flashlight to be sure I wasn't about to surprise a rattlesnake, I found myself a bush in the opposite direction from where Willie'd gone. I decided to set my tent up while I could still handle the flapping fabric. Rusty trotted along beside me while I unsaddled Molly and rubbed her down. The tent was relatively easy to master, and I had it up in about 10 minutes. I put the rain flaps over it and stashed all my other gear inside. The sprinkles of rain proved to be no more than that, for now anyway.
"Got some coffee going here,"
Willie said. He'd watched my progress with the tent. In the back of my mind, I debated whether to invite him to share it. I hadn't much doubt that his little pup tent wouldn't survive if the wind got much stronger, but I still didn't really know him very well. I decided to have some coffee and think about it. "Is that your mine, back there?" I asked, as we sat on our rocks again, with mugs in hand. For a minute I thought the gun was coming back out again.
"None of your damn business," he snarled. "Who told you about any mine anyway?"
"Melanie mentioned that you like to go prospecting," I tried. Well, after Bud Tucker was murdered and your truck was found abandoned, it began to look like you might have been killed too. Keith Randall at the cafe in White Oaks was the only one who didn't believe it. He told me you had this favorite place, and that you might have come here."
"Bud Tucker was murdered?"
His face registered confusion. "Well, that's the other thing I needed to talk to you about. Bud's daughter remembered the two of you going off together in White Oaks. Back in February, this was. So the police assumed you were together, and that whoever shot Bud might have abducted you and taken your truck." His brows pulled together as I talked. The confusion deepened.
"Bud Tucker wasn't murdered," he said. "Hell, I should know. I shot him myself."
Chapter 21. I think my mouth must have actually hung open. Time seemed suspended like something tangible in the air between us. Finally, I found my voice. You shot Bud Tucker?"
"Yep.
His face crumpled as he realized what he was saying.
It wasn't no murder, though. It was an accident."
"What?" The old man set his coffee mug on the ground between his feet and gripped the sides of his head with both hands. 2 wet tracks trailed down his cheeks. His beaten straw hat flipped off and fell behind him. He didn't notice. His fingers worked the scalp as if he were trying to squeeze the memory out of his brain. "Willie," I said gently, "tell me what happened." His mouth worked rapidly, but no words came out. "The police found a pack of your things in one of the mines," I said. "A blanket and some clothes. And Bud was wearing one of your shirts. I found him. At first, we thought it was you." He stood up and paced to the far end of the clearing, like he wanted to just walk away, but didn't know where he'd go. When he paced back toward me, I noticed his eyes were bright with moisture. I patted the rock where he'd been sitting. "Come, tell me about it. Why was Bud wearing your shirt?" He flopped down a little too hard on the rock seat and winced. He rubbed his lower back and said,
"Shouldn't be doing that, I guess."
He stared into the fire.
"Oof. Where to start?"
he said, wagging his head side to side.
"Well, Bud and me went up to look around a little. We used to go prospecting together a lot, all over New Mexico and Arizona. Thought we'd found us the Lost Dutchman mine once. Turned out to be nothing. Anyway, I hadn't seen Bud in a while, so I called him up and said, "How about let's go find a few nuggets?" And he said, "Okay." So I went down there in February, and we were just gonna look around a little. Went into one of them mines, the two of us did, and we were poking around a little, going deeper and deeper into a shaft we'd never been to before, just looking at stuff. Well, it was the weirdest thing, what we found. Bunch of big cans of stuff, like 5-gallon buckets. Some of them had labels with real scientific names on them. Hell, I don't know what any of it said, really. Bud was moving a couple of the cans around to get a better look, and I guess his arm brushed against one that had some spilled on the outside. Well, he starts shaking his arm, like this, he demonstrated, and yelling, "Ouch! Ouch! This stuff's burning me!" And I didn't know what he'd gotten himself into, so I just says, "Get the shirt off." He did. He peeled that shirt off, and sure enough, that stuff had eaten through the material and made his arm red in a little place. He threw the shirt on the ground, and I got him a clean one out of my pack. We rinsed off his arm with some canteen water, and he put my shirt on.
He got up and added more wood to the fire. "When did the gun come into it?" I asked.
"I'm getting to that," he said. Well, he just finished buttoning up the clean shirt when we heard a car drive up. It stopped right near my truck, where the road ends and the trail starts. So Bud and me says to each other, we better get out of here. So we run out the mine shaft and decide to hide in one of them old buildings. There's only one that ain't about ready to fall down, so we chose that one. And we see these two guys walk up this path to the mine we just left. One of them's a local guy. Bud knew him by name, but I can't remember what it was. And the other guy was some greasy-looking city dude. Long hair down to his ass. In a braid, if you can believe that. They head for the mine, and about 2 minutes later, they're sneaking back out, and we know that they found Bud's shirt and are out looking for us. I mean, with my truck parked there and all, it must have been pretty clear that we were still around. We're scared. That city guy's got a gun that he's pointing around, so I pull out my little sidearm here. Just to be ready.
His voice wavered, and he scrubbed at his face with his hands.
Guess I wasn't too steady with her that day, he continued. 'Cause the next thing I know, she fires. Just like that. I didn't even know I'd put my finger on the trigger, but blam! There went a shot. And I looked over, and there was Bud, lying on the floor, just as still as
His voice cracked. He stood up and paced the length of the clearing again, took a deep, ragged breath.
I didn't know what to do. It was going to be a matter of seconds before those two guys found me. The way they didn't hear that shot. Only thing I could think was, run. So I did. Hid behind some bushes while they searched the buildings. Soon as they saw Bud, they left. Got in this dark blue car and hightailed it out of there. Well, I did the same. Drove and drove.
Until you got to Las Cruces. He nodded. Then you remembered that they'd seen your truck and could easily identify it. So you got some money at the ATM and bought a bus ticket to Phoenix.
You figured all that out?
He asked, wide-eyed. It wasn't difficult. The police traced the vehicle right away after we started looking for you. I shifted position on the rock. The seat was starting to get hard. After you got to Phoenix, you got more money out of your account. And they lost track of you.
Yep. Took some more money out of the bank and bought a little bit from this guy I knew here a long time ago. got me a few supplies, and came up here. Are the police still after me?
I didn't tell him they never had been, except for questioning. I don't think so, Willie. But what about your family?
Let me think about that.
He stared into the fire for 10 minutes or so, then announced,
I'm hitting the sack now.
He poured the dregs of his coffee cup onto the ground and edged into his tent, placing the cardboard carton across the entrance. I looked over at Rusty, who was lying contentedly on the ground behind my rock seat. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, eased off the rock, and sat on the earth in front of it, using the rock as a backrest. I stared up at the briskly moving clouds until the fire had almost completely died away. Sometime during the night the storm intensified, whipping the flaps of my tent wildly a couple of times, then dying down. I heard thunder in the distance, but the rain never materialized here. I burrowed down into my sleeping bag, and Rusty posted himself just inside the tent's zipped door. By daylight, my body was so stiff I could hardly crawl from my little cocoon. I rummaged through my things and swallowed 3 ibuprofen with some of my bottled water. I'd slept soundly, considering the rough conditions and everything I had on my mind. Today I had to decide what to do about Willie. While I wasn't particularly eager to return him to the loving arms of either Felix or Dorothy, I did feel the rest of the family needed to know that he was alive and well. And if it became known that he was okay, the police just might want to ask some more questions. And I couldn't deny the fact that he'd confessed to shooting Bud Tucker. All this was running through my mind as I debated whether to slip back into the somewhat crusty jeans I'd removed the night before, which would leave me without a clean pair to wear home. My shirt wasn't in much better shape, but I decided I'd rather come back from the trail ride filthy so I could shower and change into clean clothes back in my unused motel room. I pulled on the smelly set and emerged from the tent. The air was fresh with the scent of moisture on sage. I took a deep breath and was astounded to see that the sandy wash I'd traversed the day before was now a rushing stream. I quickly checked to be sure the animals were still with us. Little Bit and Molly grazed happily in their little area, and Rusty was, as always, at my side, hoping food would soon appear. "Can you believe this runoff?" I said to Willie as he emerged from his tent. It looked a little the worse for wear through the windy night. I wondered if he'd gotten up to reset it at some point. He noticed the rushing water for the first time. "Hell fire!" he shouted. "My mining gear!" He started to rush down the path toward the water. "Willie, no! That water's got to be—" I was about to say 10 feet deep, but it was too late. He'd run right into it and was already 5 yards downstream. Without thinking, I raced after him and plunged in. Chapter 22. The first dunk took my breath away. The silty brown torrent was ice cold. I came up with a gasp and looked around for Willie. He was ahead by 10 yards now, paddling as he rode the current, working his way across to the side where his mine was. I bobbed again, touched the bottom, and slung water from my eyes. I spat foamy water and tried to paddle after Willie. My feet touched bottom for an instant. I tried to kick off and propel myself across, but succeeded only in sending myself downstream facing backward. Anyone who thinks they can battle Mother Nature and win needs a lesson like this one. I managed to get myself facing forward again, but after only a couple of minutes struggling against the current, I gave in and rode it down. I could vaguely hear Rusty barking behind me, but couldn't turn my head to look. I kept my eyes on Willie's bobbing head. He was making progress to the far side, and I did my best to follow his path. Muddy water filled my eyes again and again. Willie began to slow, reaching out for tree branches along the bank. I came up behind him, almost close enough to grab for him. Missed. He sped ahead again, turning his head as he passed his wooden cross marker. "Help!" His words were taken away as he went under. My feet hit the bottom, and I tried to dig them in. Bad idea. The water rolled me over and threw me up butt first. I righted myself, choking and swiping at the long strands of wet hair pasted over my face, looking around to get my bearings. Rusty was behind me, paddling furiously. Willie's head bounced like a cork as he popped above the surface ahead of me. I lifted my feet and rode the current after him. Straining, I reached out and got a fistful of shirt collar. I grabbed the shirt and the nearly weightless man in it. My right hand full of shirt, I tried to paddle with my left. When my feet hit the bottom for a second, I pushed toward the bank, wondering what I'd do if we both hit the rocks. The canyon walls were much lower now, but we drifted back to center stream. I watched for any opening. Ahead on the left, A good-sized sandbar. I focused all my energy there. With burning arms and legs that had gone numb, I pushed. Willie had stared at me when I first grabbed him. Now he rode along, limp. The water tried to carry us around the sandbar back to the deeper channel, but I wouldn't let it. "No!" I shouted. I felt my knees hit bottom. Crawled, using my one free hand to pull us onto the high ground. Willie suddenly weighed a ton. I gripped him under both arms and pulled, scrambling on my knees to work his body onto firm sand. Coming at me, I could see Rusty still free-floating. I raised one arm and waved to get his attention. It wasn't necessary. He was headed toward me with the single-mindedness that only animals have. At last his feet touched bottom, and he crawled forward with everything he could muster. A swirl of brown water rushed up onto our tiny shore. I pushed Rusty toward a high spot with one hand, while I grabbed again at Willie's shirt collar with the other. The water foamed over my legs, but wasn't able to grip me. I watched Willie sputter and cough. Then I collapsed. Chapter 23. Hot sun blazed into my eyes when I tried to open them. I raised one hand to shade my face. Granules of sand fell into my right eye, and I slammed them shut again, rolled to my side and shook my face. My hair hung to my shoulders in muddy ropes. I shrugged a shoulder upward and wiped my face against it. On hands and knees, I pushed myself up and sat on my haunches. Willie lay face down on the sandbar, his feet extended into the water. Rusty was higher, on dry ground. He shook himself vigorously, then cocked his head toward me. "Oh, God," I groaned, brushing my hands against my pant legs to remove some of the sand. Rusty barked sharply twice to let me know he was all right. He trotted over to me and licked my face. Decided sand didn't taste all that great and backed away. I reached out and draped my hand over his shoulders. "You scared me back there," I said. "Why'd you jump in, you silly thing?" He barked again. Willie moaned. I crawled to him and rolled him onto his side. His eyes were wide open, his mouth working. He reached up to wipe sand off his lips, only to discover that his hands were even more coated. "Ugh. Hell of a thing," he grumbled. "Are you all right?" I asked, watching him carefully. "Hell yes. Been through worse than this," he growled. Maybe so, I thought, but not at the age of 84. He raised himself to his knees, then used my shoulder to brace himself while he stood. It took a few seconds, but he soon stood upright, shaking out his limbs in the human version of what Rusty had just done. I followed his example, brushing off as much sand as I could. Considering that we'd lain there a few minutes, the water had receded remarkably. What had been a gushing torrent earlier was now just a steady flow. "Flash flood," Willie said. "No kidding. Why on earth did you jump in there?" "Why'd you?" "To save your sorry ass. You were headed downstream fast." "Hell, I've survived worse in my day. Would have done just fine here, too." There was no point in arguing with him. I jammed my hands into my back pockets and stared upstream. Not a cloud remained in the sky. Last night's storm that skipped our campsite entirely and dumped its fury in the mountains had dissipated and blown away in tatters of harmless vapor. "Water's down quite a bit," I said. "I think it'll be simpler to wait here until we can walk back up the wash than to try to make it across country, especially without a compass. It would be too easy to get off course dodging the huge boulders above. The stream bed was our best bet." I sat down beside Rusty and put an arm around him. "Got any food with you?" Willie asked. "I'm getting hungry." I shot him a look, and he closed his mouth. He paced the sandbar restlessly. I kept an eye on him, worried that he'd set off again into the water. The sun beat down, drying our clothes quickly. A mosquito discovered me and wouldn't stop buzzing around my face. I waved it away for several minutes, until it finally landed on the exposed skin of my forearm, and I dispensed it with a slap. I wanted nothing more at this moment than a hot shower and clean clothes, preferably in my own shower, at home. An hour went by, according to my dirty but waterproof watch. The rushing water receded from the edges of the wash, running now in a ribbon about 10 feet wide down the center. "Let's try it," I said. "Stay close to the edges." I soon discovered that the earth at the edges was dense clay that stuck to the bottoms of shoes in a thick muck. We moved on to the sandier portion, scuffing the clay off as we walked. Rusty trotted ahead. I noticed that his fur had dried now in crusty, pointed tufts.
He'd need a bath, too, as soon as we got home. Willie and I walked separately, neither of us speaking. All I could think about was getting packed up and getting home. "Want to see my gold mine?" Willie asked. He pointed across the wash at the wooden cross on the hillside. The stream of water in the center of the wash was now no more than 5 feet wide and probably about only ankle deep. "I want to check on things up there," he said. "Make sure none of my stuff washed out. You can come if you want to." I knew it was his way of saying he trusted me and hoped I wasn't still mad at him. "Thanks, Willie, but I think I'll start packing up my stuff. You go ahead." I watched him approach the running water. "Be careful there. Make sure you have a firm footing." He stepped into the water with a lot more respect than he'd shown the first time. It only took him 3 steps to cross to the dry side, and he turned to wave at me. I waved and continued till I came to the narrow path that led to our campsite. The small clearings looked as though nothing had happened. Both tents stood in place. The horse and mule were standing contentedly at their tethers. Last night's fire was long gone, so I poked around in the ashes, laid out some brush and kindling, and struck a match to it. Soon I had enough flame to heat a coffee pot. Last night Willie had made some strong concoction full of coffee grounds, but I didn't have his recipe. I decided to just heat clean water in Willie's battered pot and use my little packet of instant coffee from last night's MRE. While the water heated, I disassembled my tent and rolled it into its carry bag. Among my stash of food were 2 more Twinkies and a packaged fruit pie, the kind loaded with fat and calories. I opted for that. I rinsed my hands with a little of my drinking water, wishing for soap, but there was none. With most of my gear stowed in the duffel and my pot of water boiling, I sat on my rock and drank my instant coffee with my nutritious breakfast. Call it delayed reaction, call it post-traumatic something. I don't know. I just know that as I sat there on that rock seat by a campfire somewhere in the mountains of Arizona, I was hit by a sudden case of the shakes. The morning's harrowing ride down the rapids came back at me full force. My hands began shaking fast, sloshing coffee out of the mug and onto my already crusty jeans leg. I set the mug in the dirt and hugged myself. My shoulders picked up the shiver, and it traveled throughout my body. Rusty came over to me, and I hugged him while he licked my hands generously. The tremor passed finally, leaving me feeling wrung out and depleted. I wondered if I could reach Drake by phone. We hadn't touched base in 3 days, and he probably tried to call me. He would be worried by now. I pulled the cell phone from my bag and turned it on. No service, the little symbol read. I looked around. I was fairly well surrounded by rocky mountains. I'd try it again when I reached higher ground. Willie came walking up the path as I was putting my phone away. "Want to see what gold mining's all about?" he asked, holding out something in the palm of his hand. It was a small bag made from an old sock with the top cut off and a drawstring added. He gently loosened the string and dumped the contents into his hand. There were 4 gold nuggets, the largest about the size of a lima bean. "This here's my little stash," he grinned. "My rainy day money." Unfortunate choice of words, I thought, considering the last rainy day could have well ended his life. "Those are pretty neat, Willie," I said. "They come from your mine here?" "Yep. Don't tell nobody, though." He tucked the nuggets back into the bag and the bag into his pants pocket. "I wouldn't do that," I assured him. He started to pour from the coffee pot into his mug. "What the hell's this?" he asked when the liquid came out clear. I explained what I'd done. "You'll have to do your magic to make it coffee," I told him. He rummaged through his box of supplies, muttering something that contained the word women. "I ain't going back with you, you know," he said once we were seated again on our rocks with real coffee to drink. "I didn't expect you would," I told him. "Had a feeling about that." "Well, you expected right." What shall I tell them? I hadn't yet thought through a good way to explain this to Dorothy. "Tell them you never found me," he said. "What about Melanie? And Bea? They're both really worried." He set his mug down and fidgeted with the fire. I watched him for a good 5 minutes, giving him the raised eyebrow question whenever he glanced my way. "Well, all right. You can tell them too. But do you have to tell them where I am?" "What am I going to say? That I found you, but I didn't know where I was at the time?" He looked all around. "Well, that's pretty close to true, ain't it?"
He had a point. In fact, with his little sketch of a map now nothing more than a wad of pulp in my back jeans pocket, I wasn't sure I could find the place again no matter how much time I had. "What about the law?" I asked. "You confessed to me that you'd killed a man." For a minute, he looked almost panicky. "Willie, it sounds like it was an accident." I rinsed my mug and packed it away. "I'll have to think about it." I saddled Molly and strapped the duffel and sleeping bag behind the saddle. Willie watched, but didn't move from his seat by the fire. "What about your place in Albuquerque?" I asked. "Don't you ever plan to go back there?"
"Back to the loving arms of my family."
He grinned and adopted the same tone I just used.
"I don't know. I'll have to think about it."
Chapter 24. From my purse down in the bottom of my duffel, I scrounged up a business card and handed it to Willie. "Next time you go to town for supplies, call me," I told him. "I'll let you know how things worked out." I thought he'd want to know what I ended up telling his family and how they took it, but he simply shrugged and stuck the card into his pocket. I rechecked my saddle cinch and mounted. "Now that I've lost my map to get myself out of here, refresh my memory for me?" I asked.
"Down the wash to the White Rock," he said. "You didn't see it on the way up here, 'cause it's only visible from this side."
I go past the wooden cross.
"Another half-mile or so. On your left you'll see a big rock with a white heart painted on it. Under the heart is W and C."
I opened my mouth, but he interrupted.
"Right there's where your trail leads you up the canyon side."
He reviewed the other markers. I remembered them anyway. "What's the significance of the white heart?" I asked. He grinned widely, his grizzled face crinkling into a road map of wrinkles.
Ain't telling that story."
He slapped Molly on the rump, and I guided her carefully down to the sandy wash. The water flow had stopped now, leaving only a damp strip down the center of the gully. The sand at the edges was completely dry where there had been a rushing torrent scarcely 2 hours ago. No wonder people don't believe stories about flash floods. I spotted the white heart easily enough and followed the trail. The other markers weren't difficult to find, and by mid-afternoon I was approaching the horse's home stable. She knew we were getting close, and her gait picked up to an all-out gallop in the last quarter mile. I reined her in, not wanting to return her to Bert all coated with lather. She trotted peacefully the final few hundred feet. There sat my Jeep in the parking area, and there came Bert to greet us. Everything looked absolutely normal.
"Have yourself a good time?"
Bert asked, coming to take Molly's reins as I unstrapped my pack. "Sure did. Quite an adventure, the desert." He eyed my muddy clothing and Rusty's caked fur, then inspected Molly's clean legs and coat. He didn't say a word. I stowed my gear in the Jeep, assured myself that my bill was settled with Bert, and opened the back door for Rusty. My hands were a little shaky as I inserted my key in the ignition. Back in my room, it was all I could do to peel off my crusty clothing and stuff it into the freebie plastic laundry bag before turning on the hot water tap and indulging myself in a steamy shower. I shampooed my hair twice, then decided I might as well get the other fun chore over with. I called Rusty into the shower with me, not a difficult task since he loves water, and dumped half the remaining shampoo on him. After a good scrubbing and thorough rinse, we both felt better. We indulged ourselves by using every one of the room's towels. I even re-rinsed the tub twice to remove all traces of the sand we'd brought back with us. I slipped into my last set of clean clothes and debated whether to call Drake. Knowing the firefighter's schedule, I guess he wouldn't be in his room for another couple of hours at least. I decided that meanwhile I'd get some food and try to unwind. After 2 days of packaged, powdered, non-tasty grub on the trail, I wanted something substantial, but I couldn't make myself face going out in the traffic. I ended up calling a pizza delivery place and lounging back on the bed with the television on until my dinner arrived. Once I finished eating, I found myself fighting the drowsies, but knew I better call Drake before I was completely out of it for the night. "Where have you been?" he demanded when he heard my voice. "Didn't you get my message that I was coming back to Arizona?" "Yeah, but you didn't say where you were staying or what you were doing there." "I found Willie McBride," I said, not wanting to get into the minutiae of reporting every little detail. I related the story, skipping over the scarier details, making it sound more like I just ridden out to Willie's camp and had a nice little visit with him. I don't know what I'll tell Dorothy. He really doesn't want to face her again, I said, and I can't really blame him, knowing that she really didn't care about whether he made it to the reunion or not. She's really just after his money.
What about the other situation, back in White Oaks? He asked.
Well, that's changed a bit, too, I told him. I told you about the explosion at the mine. Turns out one victim was involved with drug dealers. Willie and his friend Bud saw them, and the other victim was Bud's daughter, Sophie. Rumors are flying all over town that Sophie was romantically involved with Rory Daniels. Sheriff Buckman says they're close to solving all 3 deaths out there, but he won't say how. I tried to warn Willie that he's probably still a suspect as far as Buckman is concerned. He filled me in on his adventures for the day, which almost sounded tame compared to mine. Everything was catching up with me, and by the time we hung up, I was blinking to stay awake. I pulled my jeans off and crawled between the sheets, wearing my T-shirt and undies. By the next morning, I was feeling much better, clean and refreshed. My thighs were still tender from the unaccustomed time on horseback, but the other adventure seemed well behind me. After helping myself to a bagel and coffee from the continental breakfast spread and feeding Rusty his usual nuggets in the room, we were ready to head for home. The morning air was warm already. Within a month or less, Phoenix would probably be hitting the hundreds during the day. Good time to head back to our much cooler elevation. The desert flora was crisp and green this early in the morning as we passed through the little towns of Globe and Superior. Rusty settled into the back seat, and I leaned back in my seat, getting comfortable for the long drive. At Sholo, a small town in a pretty mountain setting with lots of pine trees, I stopped to top off the tank before starting into the long stretch where it would be 80 or more miles between stations. The small town buzzed with everyday activity, pickup trucks parked in front of the feed store, women with small children walking across the parking lot at the grocery. I clipped Rusty's leash to him and led him to a dirt lot at the back of the station. As we came around the side of the building after he'd done his business, I caught a glimpse of a dark blue car cruising slowly past the station. My muscles tensed. I hung to the side of the building and peered toward the street. The road curved so the car was out of sight by the time I might have gotten a look at the license plate. I stood there a minute, unsure what to do. Rusty had reached the end of the leash now, and my arm yanked forward as his weight pulled at me. He turned a questioning look my way. Probably wasn't the same car at all, I rationalized. What were the odds? Rusty climbed back into his seat. On an impulse, I pulled out my cell phone and dialed Randy Buckman's number. Know a guy with long, wavy hair, sometimes wears it braided, who might have a reason to be following me? I asked without preamble when he came on the line. Charlie, where are you? I explained that I'd come to Arizona looking for Willie McBride and told him about my encounters with the dark blue car. Normally, I wouldn't have thought much of it, but it was way too coincidental that these people would have taken the same route to Arizona and then ended up at the same motel where I was. That's when I decided to check my vehicle. He let out a sharp whew when I told him about finding the transmitter. Well, I don't know about the dark blue car, he said. But by your description of the man, he could be Geraldo Rodriguez. He's a known drug dealer out of El Paso. We've suspected that he might have been involved with Rory and whatever lab he was supplying the chemicals to. Did he have a real thin mustache? I think so. Didn't really get close enough to tell. This guy does. Or he did in his mugshot. Guess he could have shaved it. But he's pretty proud of that thick, wavy hair. Doubt he'd change that. He backed away from the phone and cleared his throat. Watch out for him, Charlie. This guy's bad, bad news. The kind who'd probably kill you just for the fun of it. Why would he be after me? I shuffled the cell phone to my other ear, staring at the streets around me. My guess is that he's after McBride. We think he and Bud must have seen the druggies up there at the mine. It's probably what got Bud shot, and the reason they'd want to silence McBride, too. Just be careful, and don't let this guy near you, especially alone. I clicked off and locked all my car doors. Thin mustache. I knew someone else with a thin mustache who definitely wanted to know where Willie McBride was. Someone who could have worn a wig as a disguise. The thought flitted through my head, even though I felt sure Buckman was right. Felix drove a light-colored car anyway. Anyone can rent a car, Charlie. And Felix had a lot more reason to want to find his father.
I shook off the feeling and started the Jeep. Drove slowly through town, watching every parking lot and intersection for a dark blue car with a bright yellow plate. Nothing. North of Sholo, the road straightened out through the little town of Snowflake, where I saw signs for a turnoff to Heber, where Drake was fighting the fire. A big part of me wanted to turn off and find him and allow myself to be enfolded into his comforting arms. It only took a minute to get back to the reality that he wasn't in snuggling position, flying over a raging fire with all his powers of concentration needed there. I drove through, eager now just to cover the miles and get home. There was about 50 miles of two-lane empty road ahead before I'd come to Interstate 40, then a good 4 hours among 18-wheeler traffic before I'd reach Albuquerque, and I still had to figure out what I was going to tell Dorothy about her father's whereabouts. It was about 20 miles into the 50-mile stretch of nothingness that the blue car caught up with me. Chapter 25. I hadn't even seen him coming. He'd done a good job of staying out of sight while sticking right with me. I was probably 40 miles out of Sholo, where I thought I'd spotted the car, and although I was still checking my mirrors regularly, I had to admit I'd relaxed just a touch. An oldies station on the radio was right in the middle of a favorite Fleetwood Mac song, and my head had probably even started bobbing in time to it when I glanced back and there was that distinctive blue filling my rear view. I actually jumped, and with my move swerved just a touch. When I looked back in the mirror, the man was grinning at his little victory. I steadied my course and looked back again. The car was only inches from my bumper. This definitely wasn't Felix. The thin mustache was there all right, but the face was thinner and slightly darker. Buckman was right. Rodriguez was proud of his flowing head of hair. He grinned again, showing a gap between his two front teeth. The woman was still with him, laughing with that bright red mouth. I returned my attention to the road ahead. Rodriguez bumped me. I looked again. He had drifted back a few feet, but I still could see the guy. Buckman had said this guy would kill without a second thought, and I believed it. I heard his horn, just a friendly toot, right before he bumped me a second time. He'd gotten more of a run at it, and this one came with enough force to send me to the shoulder. Gripping the wheel, I righted my course again. Bam! The third bump would have been enough to send me off the side if I hadn't had a strong grip on the wheel and been ready for it. I was already doing 70, but sped up in hope of getting some distance between us. He matched his speed to mine. How far was it to the nearest town? At least 30 miles, I guessed, and I didn't see another sign of civilization. The road stretched ahead in an almost perfectly straight line. He was right in my mirror again. I debated a couple of plans. A mile or so ahead, I spotted a dirt pullout, hardly a rest area, but large enough for a vehicle to get off the road. Some kind of guardrail flanked the road just beyond it. Obviously, I wasn't going to outrun him. The sedan was every bit as fast as my Jeep, probably faster. I did have one advantage, though. Height. I looked back at him again. He was backing away to make another run at me. I sped up, putting more distance between us than he probably wanted. I was almost to the dirt pullout. He floored it, racing forward to bash me. When he was less than 10 feet away, I slammed on my brakes with both feet hard on the pedal. The Jeep fishtailed, and I pulled hard to keep her straight. The blue sedan slammed my left rear bumper, taking the corner of it right through his grill. I whipped back onto the road and gave it all the speed I dared. The sedan came at me again. He pulled close once more, and I repeated my last maneuver, braking and swerving. This time I wasn't so lucky. I veered off the left edge of the road, kicking up a plume of dust and gravel as the Jeep swerved precariously on two wheels, missing the guardrail by inches. My eyes slammed shut as I wondered where Rusty was at the moment. In slow motion, the car settled back onto all four tires, and I wrenched the steering wheel back to guide her straight onto the road. Checked my mirror once more. The sedan had slid sideways down the left lane and now sat with its passenger door wrapped around the thick wood abutment of the guardrail. White vapor billowed ominously from its front end. I slowed to a stop and looked back. Rusty had leaped over the seat into the cargo compartment and was barking furiously at the other car. My heart pounded as I shushed him. Rodriguez was climbing out the driver's door, reaching inside for his passenger. He had a smear of red across his cheek. He looked at me and started to reach toward his belt. I didn't wait. I let 2 more mile markers go by before I slowed down. At the next wide spot, I pulled over and got out my cell phone. I had to wipe my sweaty palms on my jeans before I could punch in the numbers. Dialed 911 and got a county dispatcher from somewhere I wasn't familiar with. I told him there was a wrecked car at the abutment and gave the highway and mile marker number. I also told him the man in the car was wanted on drug charges in southern New Mexico, and that he was armed and dangerous. I was guessing about the armed part. I hadn't actually seen a weapon, but better to report it that way than to send an unsuspecting officer to face Rodriguez. A howling, flashing squad car zoomed by me, heading south as I was entering Holbrook a few minutes later. I pulled off at the first McDonald's I came to, got out and stood on quaking legs, resting my forehead on the doorsill of the Jeep. The shakes set in then. I opened Rusty's door and put my arms around his neck, letting him lick my face as much as he wanted. He was content with about 5 licks before he became more interested in the smells emanating from the restaurant. "Wait here," I said. "We're both getting treats after that ordeal." I closed his door, grabbed my purse from the floor of the front seat, and walked back to survey the damage. It wasn't as bad as I'd expected. My left bumper was bent slightly upward at the corner, and the metal quarter panel had a little wave in it. Most people wouldn't even notice it, and it certainly didn't affect the way the car handled. With body shop prices what they are today, it was probably only about $1,000 worth. With a much lighter mind and a heart that was nearing its normal rate, I strode into McDonald's and ordered a Big Mac and 2 cheeseburgers with fries all around. Super size, please. I sat on a stump of the petrified wood the area is known for, with Rusty at my side, and we ate our sumptuous lunch. I watched the highway constantly, the irrational fear nagging that Rodriguez could somehow get back into his car and come after me. He didn't, and we were soon back on the road. Home never looks quite so good as when you've had a close call. In my case, make it 2 within 24 hours. I was ready to lock myself in and not come out for a week, but I still had Dorothy to face. Tomorrow, I decided. I climbed into bed and was asleep within moments. I was back in court with Dorothy, this time in my underwear. She stood again behind her table. I sat behind mine, trying to hunch down in my seat. "Your Honor," she was saying, "I submit that the defendant knows my father's whereabouts and refuses to tell me." The judge, who had been smiling indulgently at her, turned and glared at me. "I hired her to find him and to give me the results of her investigation." Her gray curls dipped dramatically as she spoke in her characteristic slur. All eyes in the courtroom turned to me. I crossed my arms over my chest, wishing I'd at least put on a lacy bra instead of the utilitarian white one I wore. "Well," the judge said, "how do you answer the allegation?" I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. "As I told the court," Dorothy butted in, "she refuses to answer." "So I see," said the judge. He slammed his gavel down. "Bailiff, lock her up and figure out a way to make her talk." This time, when the bailiff grabbed me, I fought back. I swung around and caught him in the face with my right fist. He flinched backward, and I seized the moment and ran, giving Dorothy a final, "So there," parting stare before I hit the swinging door leading to the corridor. I ran and ran, but couldn't reach the elevators. My legs were mired in something like Jell-O, and I couldn't breathe. I could hear shouts behind me. Dorothy and my pursuers were catching up. I reached for the elevator button, but it was way beyond my grasp. My legs pulled harder and harder, trying to get me there, but I wasn't moving fast enough. The crowd was about to reach me. I felt a hand on my shoulder. "No!" My scream woke me. I lay there for a full minute, gripped in the paralysis of the after-dream. My face was buried in my pillow. Gradually, I turned my head to get some air. Movement returned slowly to my limbs, like frost receding from a tree once the sun hits it. I stretched to break free from the last of it and sat up in bed, pulling the covers around me and running my hands through my hair. Could Dorothy really force me to tell Willie's whereabouts? I got up and went into the bathroom, where I ran cool water in the basin and splashed it onto my face, felt my way to a towel and patted dry, took a few deep breaths to rid myself of that suffocating feeling. Could she? I slipped back into the warmth of my blankets and noticed the bedside clock said it was only 2:15. Not exactly a decent hour to call anyone for advice. Huddled in bed, wearing nothing but a pair of panties, I felt vulnerable. I got up again and slipped on my terry robe and slippers. One thing about living in a city is that you're never in total darkness, not the same kind of deep velvet black you find in the country. By the light of the streetlights, I padded my way through the house to the kitchen without turning on lights. I poured a mug of milk and set it in the microwave to warm. The backyard was bathed in moonlight, the same moon that had shone over a tiny campsite in Arizona the night before, the same moon that was now watching over Willie and his little mule tonight. "Why should I tell her?" I whispered aloud.
only Willie and I knew his exact location. Drake was the only other person who knew I'd actually located him. I didn't have to tell Dorothy anything. I stood up straighter. No, I didn't have to tell her anything at all. I pulled the mug of hot milk from the microwave and added a packet of hot chocolate mix. But should I tell her? I stirred the hot chocolate slowly. If I told her I hadn't found him, would she simply hire another detective? I sipped at my cocoa and stared out into the yard. If I told her I'd located her father, that he was alive and well and didn't wish to come back, would she accept that? How far would Dorothy and Felix go to get those papers signed? The whole thing rattled around in my head, but I decided I couldn't stay up all night thinking about it. I yawned deeply, rinsed my mug, and went back to bed. Rusty hadn't budged from his rug, a testament to the depth of his sleep. I fell asleep eventually, still without answers. The phone startled me awake while I was still in that peaceful, no-dream state a few hours later. The clock said it was 6:13. "Charlie, Randy Buckman here." "Jeez. Don't you ever sleep?" I grumbled. "Sorry. I apologize for the early hour. Just wanted to bring you up to speed and give you a big thanks." "What did I do?" I mumbled, still only half awake. "Caught Rodriguez for us. That's all," he said. I could hear his big smile at the other end of the line. "I guess the Arizona police brought him in then?" I asked. "From what I hear, he wasn't going anywhere with whatever you did to his car." "Hey, I didn't touch the car." "Well, only a little bit." "Would it be fair if I yelled he started it?" He actually chuckled out loud that time. "There's more good news," he said. "We came across evidence that Rory is the one who murdered Bud Tucker. We just about put together a case good enough to take to the DA. Somehow, information about the evidence leaked out of this office, and I could kill the person who did it, if I just knew for sure. And Sophie found out. Looks like she decided not to wait for the courts. Looks like she followed Rory up to the mine and tracked him inside. There was a Smith & Wesson .357 beside her body, and a bullet in his. Burned as they were, we at least got that much. Chances are her shot is what set off the explosion." "Oh, geez," I said, sitting up on the edge of the bed. My mind flitted back to Willie's confession. Then things really started to get sticky. This wasn't sticky enough? When it came out that it was their two bodies in the mine, people just started to build this story about an affair between them. He sighed deeply. "It ain't the real situation, but the real one ain't any better, so I'm just letting the rumors fly. I can only hope it all dies down pretty soon. Her funeral was yesterday, and she's buried right beside her dad. Rory's got no people here, so he's been taken to West Texas, where some cousins live." "And why was Rodriguez tailing me?" "He'd seen your Jeep several times near the mines and knew you'd been snooping around up there. Assumed you'd found the drug stuff, and he was keeping an eye on you. He told us he knew you'd met with me several times and thought we were planning to use you as a witness against him in court." "That's ridiculous," I sputtered. "I didn't even know about the drug stuff, and I certainly couldn't have tied him to it." "But he didn't know that," he pointed out. "Let's just say this guy isn't the brightest bulb in the chandelier. He focused on you, and that was that." "Well, I can't say I'm too unhappy about wrapping his car around that bridge abutment then," I said. "So does that tie up all three of your cases now?" "Looks like it does," he said. "You got any news about Willie McBride for his family?" I'm still working on that one," I said. He didn't exactly ask whether I'd found Willie, did he? "Well, guess that's about it. Except there's a friend of yours here in my office who wants to say hello." I heard the phone being shuffled around. Buckman's voice in the background said something about getting some coffee. "Hey there, Charlie gal." "Keith?" "That's me." "What are you doing there?" I asked. "You didn't get dragged into this whole drug dealer arrest thing, did you?" "What?" "Ah, hell no. I just come by with some fresh donuts for the guys and heard Randy say you was on the phone. Just wanted to say hi." "Well, I'm glad you did. Looks like things in White Oaks are all wrapped up now, I said. I hesitated. Keith?
Yeah.
Know that item from your cash drawer?
Yeah.
I found the X. What you thought would be there. It was.
Gotcha.
I haven't decided yet whether to tell his family. So, don't say anything.
You bet. You stop in now if you ever get back out this way, he said, and drop me a card at Christmas.
I will. Chapter 26. I spent most of that day wondering exactly what I'd tell the McBride family members. In the end, I decided that Dorothy and Felix would have to work harder to realize their selfish dreams. I wasn't going to hand anything to them. Dorothy threw a fit when I gave her my final report and refused to pay our bill, but Bea held true to her word. I called Bea in Seattle and told her the full truth, including Willie's and my wild ride in the flash flood. She'd followed through on having a notarized statement added to the new unsigned will, proving that it had never been validated by her father. She would let Melanie know that her grandfather was alive and well, nothing more. Willie had told me he didn't want anything more to do with his family, but I had managed to persuade him to do one little thing. If he sent a Christmas card to Bea each year, it would prove he was still alive, which would leave Felix and Dorothy fuming if they tried to have him declared legally dead after he'd been missing 7 years. That little clock couldn't begin ticking until 7 years after the last card came. Bea called me about a month later to let me know that her father had actually called her. She'd convinced him that if he planned on never moving back to Albuquerque, he should sell his North Valley property. The money could be banked and would leave him financially set for the rest of his life and preclude any dirty tricks by Felix. He'd agreed, and she wondered if I could recommend a good realtor in Albuquerque. Of course I did. Drake had a busy fire season, which put his fledgling company on much firmer financial ground, although I didn't get to see much of him until the second monsoon rains began in August. Willie's confessing to shooting Bud Tucker bothered me from time to time. It was the only part I'd never told another soul, except Drake. I had a nagging feeling I should have told Randy Buckman about it. But since I didn't do it right away, the opportunity just sort of slipped away. It wasn't really a murder, I justified. From Willie's account of it, I was sure it had been an accidental shooting. Buckman had wrapped up his case file anyway. Sophie was the only one to whom it might have made a difference, and she, bless her heart, was gone now too. Even if she'd lived, that bit of news couldn't have made her life happier, so I couldn't see much point in bringing it out. It's a secret I'll just have to live with. This concludes Reunions Can Be Murder by Connie Shelton. This novel is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual events, locales, or persons living or dead is entirely coincidental. From Books in Motion in Spokane, Washington, this is Stephanie Brush. Thanks for listening.